Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session of mental health and ministry. If you could just take a moment to view the slide that's in front of you. It goes over a little bit of our housekeeping for today. Please keep in mind that the session will be recorded. And I will go ahead and be turning this over to our two presenters for today that will move forward with their presentations. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andy Fetters. I'm the pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Waukesha, Wisconsin.
And I am Ari Mattson. I am the pastor at Martin Luther Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
So you should be able to see the presentation that we have up for you. We are going to start with introductions and why we're here. So if you have a comment
thing, yeah,
what's
I
that?
don't know.
Sorry,
I'm getting the keynote headline
you're not
title
seeing
page.
what I see.
Yeah,
Is that better?
let's see. Yeah, now I can see it.
Okay. What if I do this?
Oh, now I'm seeing the keynote thing again.
Okay, we'll just flutter along this way. Fun with technology. Anyway,
Yeah.
so if you want to comment why you are here in the chat space, we encourage you to do that. Part of the reason why Ari and I are presenting this is because we have journeyed this journey of mental health together, expressing the joys and the disappointments of living with depression and anxiety, and how that affects how we do ministry and how it affects our congregations, how we approach these things, how we talk about them. And so we kind of want to know why you're here so that we can maybe address some of those specific aspects of this topic of mental health and ministry. Are you going to pick this up?
Sure. Yeah. Some of the big things that we want to address. One is, of course, just getting rid of the stigma. One of the things about mental health is that for a long time, there's been a stigma around it. We don't want to talk about it if we have some kind of mental health or issue or mental illness. It's kind of seen as something bizarre or strange when it's actually quite common. Mental health is a priority for everyone. Prior to the pandemic, we know that statistics show that at least 20% of Americans were suffering from a mental illness, at least temporarily, on any given year. Since the pandemic hit, we know those numbers have probably at least doubled, if not tripled. Certainly the level of anxiety and depression for many people, even if it's just seasonal rather than permanent, it is very big. And because faith is an important part of the support system for individuals and communities. Faith is an important part of us living our lives and figuring out who we are. Jesus is the bedrock of what we do, and that applies to our mental health as well as our spiritual, physical, and financial, and all the other health.
Yes. I want to pick up on a couple things that were shared in the chat just so we can have everybody acknowledge them. So I'm here because I have seen how mental health is affecting our church members and youth in our community. Mm-hmm. I'm here because mental health affects my wife, which affects me and my ministry, also because mental health issues affect so many of our members. Amen to that. And Michelle says, because I know and trust Andy and struggle with depression, which has been worse during the past year. And I will say amen to that. So we're going to say something probably not prophetic, but there is a difference of generational understanding and the approach to mental health. I couldn't find it, but I think it's worth sharing. There's kind of a meme or a cartoon, however you want to interpret that, that has 3 different generations talking about mental health, where baby boomers would say, well, that's not something that we talk about openly, where Gen Xers would recognize something of the effect of, I know something's wrong, but I don't know what to do with that. And then the millennials said, So I was talking to my therapist on Tuesday, right? There's just a
Yeah.
different acknowledgement of how we socially interact around those things. And if you think about the church being the one place where we encounter 5 generations of people, everybody has a different way of approaching mental health. So acknowledge that, and then if that's something we want to address specifically later on in the Q&A, we can do so.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, Ari, it's your turn to share your story.
Okay. So my story. I grew up originally in Oregon, the state, and took me a long time to realize that I had depression. In college is when I first got diagnosed with it, after many years of going through depressive periods and funks and feeling down about a lot of things. Thankfully, I had a friend that pushed me to go see a counselor. And as I talked to her, she said, yeah, you've got depression. And we put together a plan then, and it worked really well for a couple of years. It was mostly coping mechanisms. But then I found that over the course of my life, over the next 10 years, that I was having more depressive episodes and having a lot of suicidal ideation, and really not, and most of it was a surprise to everyone around me. In fact, a long time when I first tell people that I have depression, they were very surprised. I tend to be fairly positive and optimistic and friendly, but inside, my anxiety and my depression were just constantly telling me about all the ways I was failing and everything that was wrong with me, and how people didn't really like me, and so on and so forth. And that came to a head about 5 years ago, when I actually reached out to our employer assistance provider, and went through the questions that they had, and I was just answering the questions in what I thought was a pretty normal manner of, this is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? How do you feel most days? Have you ever thought about hurting yourself? And we finished the questionnaire, and the person immediately said, I think we need to get you to see someone within 24 hours. And I don't want you to be alone in that time. I thought, oh, this might be a bigger problem than I think it is. Thank God I got to a therapist, and my therapist got me to a psychiatrist, and I started taking medication. And today I am much, much better. Whereas prior, I was having suicidal ideation probably about once a month for most of my adult life. Now I haven't had any real suicidal ideation in those 5 years, which is phenomenal. That's amazing. And part of the reason that I'm here was that in one of those conversations with my therapist, I was lamenting going through a depressive episode at that time, and not being able to do my work as effectively as I wanted to. And one of the things that she threw back to me was, well, if you had the flu, you would stay home and you would rest and you would take care of yourself and you would take medicine, and you would call in and say, I can't do the job today, and and I'll make it up when I can get back to the office. And she said, you've got a mental flu, and you need to not beat yourself up for being sick. And in that moment, it kind of hit me that that I need to see this not as something other than that really it's a physical illness. My brain doesn't produce chemicals in the right levels, and just like many other chronic illnesses, that's sometimes going to flare up, and I need to deal with that. And also decided that I was going to be more open and honest about that with my congregation, and that led to some incredible conversations that we'll be getting into later, but has opened up a whole new side of ministry for me. So, all right, Andy, pass it off to you.
Ari, that's a powerful story. I like it because I can relate to it.
Right. Yeah.
My story is a little bit different. I walked into, well, so I'll preface this by saying it's always good to be in contact with other organizations because Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin came and presented to our ministerium or our cluster, whatever rendition of that you want to talk about, where pastors get together and talk about stuff. And they handed out business cards for mental health services, casework management, lots of things. And that sat on my desk for a good 9 months. And the winter, about 7 or 8 years ago, I looked at that card and recognized something was wrong and contacted them for an appointment. Walked in to see the woman who's important in my life outside of my wife, which is my therapist, Alice. And she said, "Why are you here?" And all I could tell her was, "There's something wrong." And she gave me a quick assessment, which turned out to be part of the DSM-5. And after I took the assessment, sat down, and she said, "Well, you have moderate depression." And a shocked look on my face must have given away, because she said, "That seems surprising to you." And I told her that I think I would have been okay if you would have said it was mild. So it was a recognition that something was wrong, but it was also probably worse than I had thought. I'll fast forward as I think about that session. It was 2.5 years to 3 years later, after trying to do all of the toolbox that she was giving me to work on depression and anxiety in my life. I was scheduled to go on an airplane to a conference in Florida as a Sabbath retreat and learning retreat. Missed my flight, got to the airport late, got designated the last ticket on the plane that I could get there. And so I had 3.5 hours to think about all of the things that I had just done and not adulting and making it. And so there's the way that my depression works is that there's a voice in my head that tells me I'm not good enough, like I'm a crappy father, a shitty spouse, a terrible pastor, just not a good human being. And so I recognized all this was happening. So this voice in my head was telling me, "Wow, you can't even make it to a flight on time, and you're going to be embarrassed by the time you get there," and all of this. And 3.5 hours on a plane is not a good time to think about that. So I then began to hum a very familiar tune that many of you probably already know. And I sang it to myself in my head because I think it would have been a little bit disturbing to the people around me on the plane. My depression has a first name, it's OSCAR. It was then when I was able to really identify that depression is not something I struggle with, it's something I live with, right? And sometimes I need to pay attention to the voice of Oscar, who's alerting me to things that are happening around me, but I don't have to take his advice, right? So sometimes I say that depression is the crappy apartment roommate that takes up space in my head, but doesn't give me very good advice. And so when the pandemic hit, it exacerbated everything. And we all know this, but mental health was exacerbated on ways that we never thought people would experience. So last year, in talks with my therapist, with my primary physician, I had been resisting going on medication for 7 years. And it was at the point where the pandemic made it just unbearable. And a couple different medication tries later, we're in a good place. And, that's just an ongoing conversation. So I'm going to transition both Ari and I's story to the vulnerability in which it kind of placed on us as leaders to share those with our congregations. And we're going to share 2 stories of each member of our own churches about what that looks like. But I openly shared that I lived with depression when we had a Blue Christmas worship service, and wasn't certain that that was an appropriate thing. We were somewhere in the book of Isaiah where it was talking about hearing the voice of the Lord and being confident in what was happening. And I just went, yep, And I shared that. And the overwhelming grace that was given to me helped me understand that I can be an advocate and a voice to share my own vulnerability so that other people can relate to not only our ministries and congregations, but just that God is walking with them. So that's a bit of my story. I feel like we need to catch up on some of the chat and question and answer.
Yeah, so just a couple of questions about sound coming through, actually, more technical things. Just sharing from our end, I think things are working. So if you're not
I'm
hearing
able to
something,
hear you.
and I can hear you. So
So
check speakers.
crank up your speakers, everybody.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot's been added to the chat here.
Yeah, let's just address those now.
Yeah, I'm a pastor with ADHD and it affects my work, and I have previously had congregation members assume that I can't do the job because of it. I now have a 4-point interim proving them wrong. All right, excellent. And I just got diagnosed with ADHD about 4 months ago, so I'm learning about that one now too. So all power to you. Paul writes,
we can celebrate that with you.
Yeah, my community's experienced a lot of recent deaths, so I'm here because I want to be able to walk with others during their grief, anxiety, and depression. Excellent. Yeah, I'm attending the session because I serve as a mental health advocate facilitator for mental health advocates in 25 Lutheran congregations in 10 counties in Northeast Indiana for the Lutheran Foundation, and I would like to be able to better equip our advocates' churches. All right, great. I'm sure we could learn a lot from you too, Carol. I'm here because I experienced clinical depression in the mid-90s while serving as a seminary professor. With therapy and antidepressants, I was able to recover and manage. So I'm very interested in your stories of how you manage your health and ministries. And then Stacy says, I appreciate you sharing. I can relate and I'm thankful. I know I'm not alone.
Yeah, there's a power to storytelling. And one of the things that we want to address now is there's a need, and always has been a need, for public sharing. But there are boundaries that go with that sharing, right? I think you heard both Ari and I talk about our own vulnerability and entering into those conversations with the communal practice of worship, but also the one-on-one conversations that we have with other people. And it is to say, if you've read anything or heard anything or seen a quote from Brené Brown, she talks about storytelling as a powerful thing. But remember that it's your story and you have the power to tell it. And I think that's important. In my own experience, having the opportunity to share in a public witness my living with depression and anxiety gave a forum to that storytelling. And not everybody has that platform. And a little bit later on, we're going to have some practical do's and don'ts with mental health and ministry, which might be the best thing that we do all day.
Right.
But just recognize that if you are sharing your story, you have the power to tell it the way that you need to tell it and to the people you need to tell it to. And if somebody tries to co-opt that story, there are things that you need to do to set boundaries around that.
Yeah. And I'll just add on to that, knowing when and where it's appropriate for you to share your story is also good. My church is fully aware that I live with depression and anxiety. One of my personal boundary rules is if I'm experiencing an episode, I don't bring it up. That is not a good place, or I'm not in a good mental state to be able to dissect it or converse with someone about it. If I'm in a pits, I don't talk about it. It's only when I'm in a healthy place that I will bring it up in the conversation.
Yeah, and one of those boundaries that I keep, which I think is important for all of us, is that we are simple parish pastors who live with depression and anxiety. We are not trained professionals. We are not counselors. We do not have education in how to deal with these things. And so oftentimes we will especially now, talk about the need for communal support, right? How do we engage sharing that support with one another, becoming resources for one another, being able to sit and listen with people is a difficult but important practice. But when people need professional help, we need to send them on to professional help. So one of the things that's important in how we share our story is also to hear God's story in the midst of that. And so one of the things that we're going to do now is to talk about biblical narratives that help engage what God might have to say about this topic of mental health and ministry. And so Ari and I have both picked a passage of scripture to relate it. And so Ari, I'm going to let you start with
Luke 10, the Good Samaritan. Yeah. So familiar story to many of us, I'm sure, if you want to follow along at home or need the refresher. Luke 10, 25 to 37. And this is what it says. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? They said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you've given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him. When I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The man said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So for me, this is a powerful passage about mental health and how to work it in ministry, because in this story, when the Samaritan finds the man that's in trouble, to see this through the lens of a mental health issue, first, he doesn't ask questions or doesn't accuse him. Well, why are you in this situation? Why weren't you safer? Or anything like that. He just recognizes that he has needs and he addresses the immediate needs. Likewise, in a mental health thing, if someone comes and says, I'm really struggling with depression, with OCD, with PTSD, even if they don't have the words, not trying to too much analyze or put blame or that, but simply, you're in pain, let's deal with the pain. Let's acknowledge that. And then the Samaritan takes him to a professional, right? Here's some place that you can heal. I can't do everything for you. Here's an innkeeper, here's a therapist, here's a psychiatrist. They can do more for you. And then the other really important thing is, and I will follow up. Someone else is going to help you with this part, but I'm not abandoning you. And that is such an important part of mental health ministry as well, is having, for me and in my ministry to others, is being able to say, I'm going to walk with you, I'm going to accompany you, and I'm going to check in from time to time, and make sure that this relationship goes on. So it's not mental health ministry. Helping people is almost never a one-time kind of thing. It's going to be an ongoing relationship builder.
That's such a great way of interpreting that story. I want, before we get into my biblical narrative, I want to just continue to invite you as we continue this presentation. If there are questions and that you have, please place them in the Q&A. Some we'll get to probably right away, and we're reserving a long time at the end of this for us to really be in conversation with you. So
Yeah.
Ari and I always talk about this as an ongoing conversation because we started this a long time ago. And we do so because we want the conversation to continue.
Yeah.
Because the more the conversation happens, the less stigma there is out there in addressing it. So,
yeah.
Okay, so my biblical narrative is one of my favorite Bible characters of all time. His name is Bartimaeus. So we find him in, well, I'm going to read from the Markan version in Mark 10. Then they reached Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples left town, a large crowd followed him. A blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting beside the road. When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." "Be quiet," many of the people yelled at him. But he only shouted louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." When Jesus heard him, he stopped and said, "Tell him to come here." So they called the blind man. "Cheer up," they said. "Come on, he's calling you." Bartimaeus threw aside his coat, jumped up, and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. "My rabbi," the blind man said, "I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go, for your faith has healed you." Instantly, the man could see, and he followed Jesus down the road. So I relate to Bartimaeus because when people shush me, I get louder. But I think part of understanding how this fits in context with the Gospel of Mark is important. If you are even a little bit familiar with Mark, there's just this ongoing, it's the next thing immediately. And we're constantly going and going and going. And in this narrative, Bartimaeus crying out to Jesus gets him to stand still. It is the first, and I think is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus stops what he's doing. That's important to name because I think it helps us understand that God cares about our concerns, whatever they may be. And that Jesus enters this dialogue of asking this blind beggar, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" He could have easily recognized that Bartimaeus was blind and that by healing his sight, he would do a great thing in his life. But Jesus insists on asking him the question, which I think is important in mental health. We cannot make assumptions about people and their need. And so the clarification of what is it that you want me to do for you really kind of, that's an audacious claim that Jesus encounters this blind beggar and asks him that question. Entering into the conversation that we're talking about, it's healthy to continue. Bartimaeus is able to name it, even and especially when people told him to be quiet. Says something about Jesus' accessibility to people who are in pain. That sometimes we have to cut through all the people who try and quiet us and allow Jesus to speak into it. And I think that's a powerful thing when we give people, when we empower other people to name their own stories and how mental health affects them. And I love all the comments of I'm here because mental health is affecting everyone. You cannot throw a pebble and not recognize that somebody is struggling. And I also like this story because much like Bartimaeus naming it, my encounter with my therapist with you are living with moderate depression is one of those things where you can't escape reality, right? It is naming the thing that is in front of you, and it goes from something's wrong to, oh, I live with depression. I also want to pause here and say that there's a ton of misuse of the biblical narrative to demonize mental health. I even had an experience sharing living with depression when a very loving member came up to me and said, well, you know, that's Satan, right, Pastor? Well, that's not necessarily how this works, but that's why it's important that we talk about the biblical narrative in a healthy way when we're encountering the scriptures and also the issue. All right. So we are going to move on to our congregation members' storytelling, recognizing that our story affects the places in which we serve as well. So I'm going to try and do this, Ari. And if you're ready, I may count on you to go to your story first.
Okay. All right.
So just be prepared.
Yeah. And maybe while you're doing that, I'll bring up. This might be a good place. We got a question. How much do you tell your church leadership, executive board, or something like that? Do you use them as some kind of accountability that you're taking medicine, seeing a therapist, etc.? I am, and I'll just answer that to say that I'm very open with everyone in my church. I don't use them as a kind of accountability. Because I don't want to, that's one of the things I think one of those boundaries is trying to recognize my therapy and my help does not come from my congregation. I take care of myself outside of that so that I can be a good pastor to my congregation. And I'm open and vulnerable about what I'm going through with my congregation so that they can be open and vulnerable, as you'll see in these stories. But yeah, my accountability comes outside the congregation. So.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we're allowed to give permission to address those things in a later format, because sometimes I think those questions kind of jog me a little bit. I'm like, I don't know how to answer them in a healthy way right away. I also think that being proactive about these things helps share that narrative or keep it a safe narrative.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. We do find your support systems in places other than your congregation. Now, there are great congregational aspects of grief groups, of people, safe places where those things can be discussed. But I set a quick boundary on, I will ask for help if I need it. And that's the other thing I love about the Bartimaeus stories. We never assume and jump to conclusions. We entertain the conversation back and forth. So ask the question. Like in those instances, I said, I'm so glad that you're willing to support me, but I don't want to get it from you, right? So, all right. Well, I'm going to share my congregation member, Deb Gerner, who lovingly shared this story because it's the other side of the coin of the conversation that I've mentioned about my own story. The first time I ever shared that I had depression and anxiety in a large open setting was part of what she's going to tell you. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get to her video.
Hello, I'm Deb Gerner, and I'm a member of St. Mark's. And about 6 years ago, I was in a huddle, the pastor of St. Mark's. And in the huddle, we get pretty personal and we share things we might not share with everyone that we know. And in that process, the pastor had felt comfortable to ask me afterwards if I felt that he should address our congregation about his issues with depression and anxiety. And I have to confess that my reaction was no. The reason it was no was not because I had negative feelings about mental health stuff at all. However, I was really frightened for him. Our congregation has history of kind of judgmental at times, and I really didn't want us to go back into that time. I didn't want Pastor Andy to have to endure the talk back, the comments being made, and just Pastor Andy is one who is pretty authentic. He is who you see is what you get, and I just felt that might be making himself a little bit too vulnerable. Pastor Andy is soft-hearted and sensitive person to people's needs and feelings, and I just, in my estimation, want to protect him from that. I was wrong. As it turns out, I'm glad he went on to ask somebody else to consider that. It was far better wisdom than mine. Pastor did address the issue during our Christmas event, which is the beginning of December. It's an event for people who are suffering for many reasons, for loss, for mental health, for like an absence of how Christmas used to be for them. And then there's those people who just like to come to the quiet and to reset their Christmas. At any rate, I get off topic there. I'm sorry, I have a tendency to do that sometimes. During that event, the pastor spoke, and he revealed this intimate truth about himself. And I've got to admit, I was taken back, and my eyes scanned the room to kind of get a reaction. I held my breath, crossed my fingers, said a little prayer, and as it turned out, it went over very well. Yes, maybe a naysayer here or there, but by and large, the overwhelming truth is that people accepted that information, not just accepted, they embraced it. I would almost say they were relieved to get that information, relieved to have a person to talk with about their mental health issues, someone who would understand, not just give a textbook response or to spout off some biblical reference, but someone who got it. The old thing that walk a mile in my shoes. And there's so much truth to that. So at our church, Marks, we address mental health issues. We have members in our church that do have mental health issues, a wide array of things that they deal with on a daily basis. Some are getting help outside of church, some are not. But I think the thing, every single person knows that if they wanted to get that that he has open office out more than that.
So I'm now seeing that there's trouble hard hearing. If you are in the presentation thing where you access this, there's a handout, and part of the presentation has Deb's video in it, which you can watch in an array. I'm not sure why we're having those issues, but the summary of her her conversation with me was she was in one of my first discipleship huddles. So within 2.5 years of being the pastor of this church, I started a discipleship huddle where we met together. We talk about scripture. We relate it to everyday life. We pray for one another. And it really is like the greenhouse effect of discipling one another. And it was in that setting in which I first shared that I had depression and was diagnosed with being moderately depressed. For about a year, we made that a part of our conversation together. And that Blue Christmas that we were headed into, Deb was a big part of setting it up. And I said in our huddle the day before, I said, I'm really feeling called to share this part of my life. And Deb, out of love for me, said, don't do it. It will not go well. And as she said, like every congregation, we have some members who are judgmental and maybe not handle that well. And the rest of her story was saying, I'm glad I was wrong about that his vulnerability and sharing gave access to a lot of other people to acknowledge stuff that was happening in their own life. That's a quick summation. Ari, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. And I'm going to hope that my sound works better. So, yeah. Welcome, everyone. I'm Pastor Ari Mattson. I'm pastor at Martin Luther Church, and with me is Melinda Acarius, a member of my congregation. And Melinda, thank you for being here. I just wanted to have you here to ask you a bit about what it's meant to you that I have been sharing my own mental health journey and what difference you've seen that make in the congregation.
Well, thank you for asking me. It has meant a great deal for me personally, and I've seen it make a difference in our congregation. Our congregation has got the opportunity to use things like the mental health check every week, which I think is very valuable and always gets a lot of responses for people to air what's going on with their lives. People who may not have or want to say, I have intermittent or continual mental illness, but it helps all of us, I think, recognize that our mental state is part of our health. Everybody's got a mind, everybody's got health. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the mind's health has issues. Personally, as you know, I've got a lot of constant issues going back about 50 years that I take medication for and that I have counseling for. And just having a pastor who identifies with that and who is living and working successfully in a dynamic congregation allows me to recognize that I don't have to sit around whining about, oh, I can't do that, I'm mentally ill. And I think it's had that effect on a number of other people. That I think congregation is supportive. It's aware. So we support each other and we're aware that these things may be going on. It doesn't mean that we pry or that we ask even, but that the way we interact with each other is respectful of the individual things that may be happening in a person's life, whether or not they choose to share them. Yeah, I'm bipolar. And yes, it affects my life. And yes, if I forgot my meds yesterday, it's going to make a difference, a little bit of a difference in how I function today. And yes, if I get too excited, I'm going to get really depressed. But I'm not complaining about that. I'm saying, being aware of that. I have worked 45 years and been retired for 5. And thank you very much, but I'm very happy with my life and feel very blessed. I have never been in a church where that statement was a part of anything I shared. And I think the recognition and the support comes from people who see you being supportive and see how you become supportive and accepting and follow your lead. They follow your model.
Mhm.
If you're in a leadership position, you have to set the tone. And supportive is the tone at Martin Luther. One other thing I wanted to say, though, I don't think a pastor has to have the extent of mental health issues that, say, you have or some pastors have in order to be supportive and set a good tone. And that every pastor gets very tired and every pastor gets depressed at times and frustrated, especially in a pandemic. I don't think a pastor should say, well, I can't do that because I haven't been diagnosed.
Right. Thank you. That's a great thing to share as well. Yeah. Yeah, because not every pastor is going to have that, but they can still create the environment of support, like you were saying. And absolutely, that's what we're hoping to do. Yeah. And I'll just say real quick, Melinda is one of those people that after I shared in a sermon at one point that depression and anxiety are a part of what I'm living with, she was able to come to me and to share that story. And now, as you can see, she's very public with it in church. And as she said, not in a attention-seeking way, but she's just open about the fact that she has bipolar, and we've created a situation where it's pretty normal for us to talk about that. And so she can, one of the advantages is that sometimes she can talk to people and say, hey, you know what, my bipolar's off this week, and you know, I need some extra support, or I just need to be left alone, or I need what have you. And but she's one of the most active people in our church. She's on our church council, and has a lot of wisdom to share. So
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So I want to move us into our do's and don'ts of ministry and mental health. I also realized that if we ask the 29 people who are on with us to add to this, we'd have a huge encyclopedia. So recognize that this is like, we narrowed this down to 10.
yeah.
All right, well, let me share my screen because I think I have it up here. At least I did. Here we go. All right, sharing the screen now. Here we go. So these are our do's and don'ts. That blank space is there because I couldn't articulate in a short amount of time what we were going to talk about as a don't, but
Yeah.
let's just address a few of these. And if there are questions that come up while you're hearing them, this is just part of our attempt to establish healthy boundaries around engaging this conversation of mental health and ministry. So, Ari, why don't you start, and then we'll ping pong back and forth.
Sure. Yeah. And most of these are about helping people who come to you with mental health issues. Not so much about us as people with mental health issues needing help, but how we address and create supportive environments in our congregation. So the first, do listen. Really attentively listen to what they are telling you and what is there. Don't try to diagnose. Again, we're not the professionals. And the biggest thing that people often need is just to be heard. Have someone understand them, to just recognize and reflect back to them the pain that they're
Yeah, and I recognize that Lutherans don't like the book of James, but what is it, James 1:19? Dear brothers and sisters, be slow to speak and slow to anger.
Amen. Mhm.
Yeah, that diagnosis goes back to, we are not trained professionals on this.
Mhm.
Giving prescriptions are not helpful. So the next one is, do meet people where they are. There's a long journey in all of this, and people may be at the very beginning of understanding their own mental health or the mental health of the people around them. Or they may have been in counseling for 50 years and are coming to a new understanding or leaving some things behind. But that part of listening is meeting people where they are, and helping yourself to understand where they are in the journey. So that blank space was a Brene Brown quote about being empowered to share your own story. And I think that's helping us listen to the story that's being told, not trying to figure out what's wrong with it.
Yeah. Next, do acknowledge their feelings. Very often, if someone is in a mental health crisis or episode, their feelings are the entirety of their reality. When I am depressed, the fact that I am feeling down, that is all that I really know or recognize. And having someone trying to tell me why I'm feeling that way, or that I shouldn't feel that way, or anything like that, or trying to logically reason through it, is not helpful. Just, I can tell you're in pain. I can tell you're really upset. I can tell you're really anxious about this. Acknowledge where they're at, and don't demonize their mental health. Goes back to some of what Andy was saying. With sometimes we use the Bible to try to say, well, if you're struggling with this, it means you don't have enough faith, or you just need to pray your way out of it, or it's just Satan. That's the logical reason for it. So,
yeah, I think one of the most powerful things that I say to people when addressing mental health or even just feelings, that sucks.
Yeah.
That, I mean, it is just an accompaniment and acknowledgement.
Yep.
And I think that leads to this next do compliment courage. So one of the ways that looks like for me is to say, I realize that must have been very hard for you to share. So I applaud your courage to share it with me, and I'm honored that you chose me as somebody to tell this story to. It's a very hard thing to share and to be vulnerable, and we want to encourage people in their courageous aspect of coming forward and talking to us. I mean, who are we? It's a little bit humbling too. And then, goes without saying, but we need to say it. Do not shame people for sharing. It is far too often that courage gets shut down very quickly. We all have examples of that in our own life, I think. But we want to make church a place where it is safe to share.
Absolutely. Yeah. And responding with, well, this isn't a place to talk about it, or something like that, is just going to crush that, because it probably has taken some courage to get to that point for someone to share. Absolutely. Next, give them the power of decision. Want to empower them. Mental health is not a mechanical thing that you can fix with a wrench and some screws. It's the work has to come from them. You can help guide, but so they need to be able to have the power of decision over what's going to be helpful, and what it is that they actually need in that moment. As Andy said with the Bartimaeus story, what do you want me to do for you? There may be times the immediate answer is not, I want you to cure my blindness. It's, I'm hungry. Okay, let's deal with that. So Give them that power, and don't try to logically argue with someone when they're sharing their emotions, as I was just saying.
It's like arguing with a toddler or a drunk person, right?
Right, yeah. Not going to get you very far.
The next one is share your own vulnerability without making it about you. So part of that is sometimes we talk about this as accompaniment, right? That we're walking next to people. If we make it about ourselves, then we're walking in front of them or behind them or even away from them. I think it's safe and acceptable to say, thank you for sharing that with me. I resonate with what you're saying because I share some of the same mental health issues. And that is just sharing your vulnerability without then don't insert your own issues, right? Like, well, when my uncle had depression, XYZ later, that goes back to the demonize or diagnose, or dominating the conversation about your own mental health to say, well, this is how my depression works for me. Because then people are less willing to share with us.
Right, and the next part, offer accompaniment, as Andy was just saying. This is again, it's not something that's going to be fixed in a 5-minute conversation. In fact, fixing is not the language that should be in mind. It's about relationship and connection. So offer to be there with them, to check in, to help them find resources if that's what they need. Or sometimes it's just sitting and listening and not much else. And don't offer simple solutions. Bumper sticker quotes are great for bumper stickers. They're not good for crisis.
That's so well said. Do offer to pray with them. As faithful people, I think one of the best things that we can do is just bring everything to God. And it doesn't even have to be elaborate prayer. Hearing somebody say your name and lifting you up to the Lord is a powerful healing aspect. It helps us recognize everything that we just said. We know that God is walking with us too in accompaniment. And then again, don't judge their faith journey. Far too many times we hear people say, well, you haven't prayed hard enough, or your faith is shaky at best, or you didn't have enough faith. That is destructive to the faithful walk that God provides for us.
Yep. Next one, a good thing to do, ask more questions. Practice curiosity. I think curiosity is a spiritual gift that we don't emphasize enough, and it's very good here. And when I say ask more questions like, well, why is it that you feel that way? Or, is there some history to that? What would be helpful for you in this time? Is there? You mentioned this, and I'm not sure I fully understand what you meant by that. Can you tell me more about that? Finding ways to try to better understand, and then avoid using statements of stigma, statements that simplify it, or, well, if you're depressed, this is the problem, or do you really have OCD, or is it that you're just stressed? Things like that are not helpful.
And all right, both of us being men, we have
Mhm.
heard this from other people. Just man up.
Mm.
I hate
Yeah.
that one. I
Yeah.
absolutely hate it.
Yep. So.
And the last do's and don'ts are make statements of understanding and compassion. To share our own feeling with somebody, I think is helpful. like saying, man, that must suck. And I don't even have any idea what that means to you, but I really appreciate you sharing it with me. And the compassionate aspect, you know, like how many times in the Gospels did we hear, and Jesus had compassion on them. That is part of our way of being little Christ to each other. And don't question their ability to handle this, right? They are the ones that are living with this. We are the ones that are living with this. We find different ways of doing and managing that on different levels. And it's not our job to question whether they can handle this or not. Now, I do want to say in the background of things, if you get a sense that people are a danger to themselves or others, contact somebody who can help with that.
Andy, we just got a note. We're supposed to be done now instead of 3:45. So we've been working on the wrong timeline. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. Why don't we throw the resources up there? And there are a couple of questions here that I want us to try to get to really quickly. I know that we've got some other stuff to get to. A couple of simple ones. One person asked, do you see a Christian therapist or a secular one? I see a Christian therapist, but honestly, the biggest thing is just finding someone that you're comfortable with that's helpful.
And I see a secular therapist, but she understands my background and my faith and is able to walk with me in that too.
Yep. There was a question from someone, does your illness help in certain parts of your ministry, and does it make other parts more difficult to do, which fall into each category? That's a fabulous question. And yeah, I wanted to be able to take a chance to say that, yeah, I now see my depression, my anxiety actually as one of my strengths, because I think one of the things it's taught me to do is, because I'm anxious and that a lot of the time, it's taught me to listen really well, and it taught me to focus in on what people are saying and doing, because my depressed brain is looking for all the reasons that they're mad at me or disappointed in me, but it's also taught me to be really aware to things that I feel like I'm much more in tune to people's emotional state than I probably would be otherwise. So
yeah, and I would say it's helpful just to recognize that I need support, and then I need to have a conversation with my friend and colleague Ari when things get bad, or I need to call my therapist for an earlier session, or again, just encounter that conversation so we take the stigma away. So I think that way it's helpful. It's also, you know, hard to manage when there are different expectations when you're in leadership, and some people don't think that we should share those things. Other people are glad that we do. How we respond to them is important too. Not everybody gets it, and not everybody will. So we too have to meet people on a different level, even when it's unexpected.
Are there any other, I'm trying to scan through, see if there are other questions that we needed to get to.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who attended. Ari and I see this as kind of like our fourth part of our conversation, and we expect that there will be more. I think our contact info is in the thing if you want to contact us to share deeper stories or questions that we might be able to help accompany you with as you do this with your congregation, providing safe places for that. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I put my email in the chat, and yeah, happy to have an ongoing conversation about this and follow up with anything that you may want to know.
Mine's in there too. Oops, I did that to Lene only. Hold on.
Oh.
Sorry.
No problem. All right, well, thank you both, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and end the session now, and I hope all of you have a good rest of the day.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right.
Godspeed.
Thank you very much. Godspeed.